We've seen the protests, but what about progress? We ask, have months of demonstrations made any real change so far?
What we do to hold our leaders accountable to the promises they've made these last few months really matters.
And we've heard about the glass ceiling. Tonight, we talk about the black ceiling.
I felt like I couldn't get it right no matter how hard I tried.
And lots of companies and businesses are talking the talk. But is it all just for show?
Seeing power and seeing how power operates is a really powerful thing for people who have never experienced that in their lives.
Thanks for joining us tonight for Facing Race. I'm Joyce Taylor. Over the last several months, we have talked about different ways to fight racism, from learning what systemic racism looks like to having the tough talks with your friends and your family. But what has really changed since May 25th, the day that George Floyd died in Minneapolis? Steve Bunin takes a look.
The killing of George Floyd, caught on cell phone video, catapulted our country into a summer of protests, with millions of Americans pushing for, demanding long overdue change. And there were some immediate changes symbolically, to be sure. But what about policies? What about policing itself? What actually has changed since George Floyd was killed 7 months ago?
Hundreds of Confederate statues from the Deep South to here in Seattle were taken down by activists or by local governments. Black Lives Matter murals and tributes to those who died went up in front lawns and on city streets all around the world. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had 4 portraits of Confederate congressmen taken down at the U.S. House of Representatives, and House Democrats passed the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act to combat police misconduct, excessive force, and racial bias in policing, though it still hasn't been brought to the Republican-controlled Senate floor. NASCAR and each branch of the U.S. military banned the Confederate flag, and Mississippi finally became the last state to eliminate the Confederacy from its state flag. Several sports franchises and schools changed their mascots, from the Washington, D.C. NFL team to Juanita High School in Kirkland. School boards in Seattle, Minneapolis, Denver, and Portland all severed ties with local police departments, turning campus security over to private organizations. The city of Seattle banned police chokeholds, as did San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and more. Mayors and police chiefs from Chicago, Baltimore, and Phoenix, as well as others, joined forces to create the Police Form and Racial Justice Working Group. Dallas police adopted a duty to intervene rule, requiring officers to intervene if another one is using excessive force. Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and Seattle all reduced their police departments' budgets, although none were slashed as much as some activists wanted. But in Seattle, the contention between the mayor, the police, and city council over police funding,
I'm done. Can't do it,
triggered the sudden retirement of Carmen Best, the city's first African-American police chief, in September. More attention came to the investigation over Manuel Ellis's death in Tacoma police custody, and by next year, police departments in Tacoma, Everett, and Bremerton will join officers in Seattle, Spokane, Kent, and other cities who are required to wear body cameras, although to be fair, all of those departments who are adding body cams in 2021 had plans in the works well before Floyd was killed. At the state level in Washington, Governor Inslee established a social justice committee, and lawmakers are working on various pieces of legislation to improve police accountability by making it easier to decertify bad cops, by creating a use of force database, by having civilians lead investigations of misconduct, by mandating officers to intervene when they see misconduct, or by simply banning police chokeholds statewide. But no laws have been enacted, in part because state politicians haven't been in Olympia since March and won't reconvene until the new year. When they do, it will be a more diverse body than ever before. To be fair, many of the candidates registered before George Floyd was killed, but more people of color were elected to the state legislature than ever before. The number of black women will triple from 2 to 6, and in Maryland Strickland, Washington elected a black woman to U.S. Congress for the first time.
In Seattle, one change is the police department's budget. Protesters wanted money spent on policing to be used for other programs. The city council cut $69 million, about 18% from the police budget, less than the 50% protesters demanded. So what would real change look like? We asked Seattle's Ijeoma Oluo, the author of So You Want to Talk About Race.
We haven't figured out in this current generation how to sustain long-term resistance, and we need to. And what we can do to support that, to keep that movement going, to continuously keep the conversation going in ways that don't just look like massive protest is what really matters. What we do to hold our leaders accountable to the promises they've made these last few months really matters. And I would just really stress that right now, pay attention to the promises that have been made by local government, by police forces, by schools, and by your employers, and hold them to it. Don't let it just be a soundbite. Make it something that people have to work on, and continuously communicate what is and is not being done, so that we know when we do need to get right back out there into the streets, or when we really do need to kind of raise the volume on what we're saying to make sure that the fundamental change really happens.
Since our interview with Ijeoma Oluo, she's released a new book called Mediocre: The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. It's a provocative title. USA Today describes the book as summing up the problems with a society that values white maleness above everything else. Right after the death of George Floyd, dozens of companies released statements promising to fight racism at the corporate level. But in the latest list of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, only 2 are black men. There is not a single black woman on this year's list. In the corporate world, it's called the black ceiling. Angela Poe Russell talks to 2 people, one employee, the other employer, trying to make a difference.
I struggled for years wondering what was wrong with me. How could I better myself? How could I fix myself? What soft skills did I need? How do you get the seat at the table? I questioned my own, am I not professional?
Talisa Lavery of Seattle admits that she almost gave up on herself.
I didn't even want to live anymore. I felt like I had no place. I felt like I couldn't get it right no matter how hard I tried.
Her struggle, life in corporate America. Lavery worked as an event planner for more than a decade, a dream job that turned into drama.
Although I was able to get through the door, I suffered a lot. And I didn't know at the time they were called microaggressions or biases, right?
Microaggressions are described as the indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. Talisa gave us one of the more egregious examples.
I was working closely with another white woman, and she began to talk about how she would bring her husband to this particular event. And just out of curiosity, I said, "Oh, are we able to bring a guest to the event?" And she said, "Sure, as long as he doesn't have braided hair and gold teeth."
Because attracting the right candidates is all about the right job listings.
Ruchika Tulshan, an inclusion strategist and author of The Diversity Advantage, says stories like Talisa's are quite common. And she says until the protests this summer, most companies were reluctant to even talk about race.
When I was asked to speak at organizations, especially large, well-known organizations, the call to action to me was, please don't really talk about race. You can mention it, but please talk about gender equality, talk about women in the workplace.
And in her work, Ruchika points to another frustration that gets in the way of progress.
This idea of meritocracy. This idea that if you work hard enough, you're going to get ahead. And therefore, if people are not represented in the workplace, people of color are not represented in the workplace, it's because they didn't try hard enough. They didn't get the degrees that they needed to get. They didn't lean in hard enough. And what we find, and data backs this up, is that's absolutely untrue.
And discrimination seems to start with the resume, according to research in the Administrative Science Quarterly. Out of 1,600 people studied, 25% of black candidates received callbacks if their resumes removed racial clues like a first name or affiliation, while only 10% got calls when they left ethnic details intact. Among Asians, 21% got calls if they used so-called whitened resumes, whereas only 11.5% heard back if they sent resumes with racial references. And there appears to be economic consequences to this. Research shows the black and white wealth gap is as wide as it was in 1968, regardless of the education level. Black families whose main wage earners graduated from college have about 33% less wealth than white families whose heads dropped out of high school. After the recent Black Lives Matter protests, numerous corporations publicly expressed their support and promised change.
There's a way that things keep happening, that the same damn thing happens generation after generation. And it's because somebody decided to go along with it instead of trying to stop it.
That's Glenn Kelman, the CEO of Redfin, talking about the company's efforts to reduce bias when it comes to hiring and promotions.
It doesn't mean that someone has some nefarious racist past. It just means that we all come into work with groups of people we're comfortable with and groups of people who we haven't talked to as much. And it may be that we end up giving the answers to the test to somebody we play tennis with. And then they tend to do better at work.
Redfin started focusing on racial diversity in 2018, specifically in management roles, and their own data shows the progress has been slow. But after the recent protests, the company doubled down, implementing bonuses for senior executives if they hit specific diversity targets, and increasing what's called pay transparency. That's when salaries are no longer a big secret. Experts say it's one way to reduce the pay gap.
You have to be able to tell a Black employee, a female employee, a white employee, here's the average, you're below the average because you're underperforming, or you're above the average because you're overperforming. And here's the data that I'm basing that on, this project or that project or this sale or that sale. But just saying the pay is fair. These are not the droids you're looking for. We need to move on. You will never move on. And there is no more sincere form of recognition than just paying people what's right.
Other companies are also ramping up diversity efforts. And late summer, Amazon announced a number of new hires in key positions and appointed the first Black executive to Jeff Bezos' team. It's a group of leaders who set the company's priorities. Nordstrom says by the end of 2025, it'll increase representation of Black and Latino people in leadership roles by 50%. Starbucks set similar goals and launched a mentorship program to connect employees of color to senior leaders. But make no mistake, these are also business decisions. Research from the consulting firm McKinsey found in the 3 years studied, companies with racial and ethnic diversity on the executive team financially outperformed those without by more than 30%. And Kelman says his company has seen firsthand the value of diverse teams.
It wasn't just some high-minded liberalism, that it was a business pragmatism. There are all sorts of problems where we just kept looking at it one way until we brought a diverse team onto that problem and had all sorts of perspectives and a better capacity to listen and to be humble and to think that we might be too full of ourselves.
But hiring for diversity is very different than retaining them. Talisa is proof of that, running her own consulting business now and releasing a book called Confessions from Your Token Black Colleague. She says it's validation for some and a call to action for executives.
The request is for you, yes, to make an extra effort to eliminate those biases and to increase the number of marginalized people within your company, and not to check it off the box. Yes, it's an investment of time, there's an investment of money in getting people together, but it's worth it.
We have more on how local companies have changed since the recent protests on king5.com/facingrace. Hiring more women and people of color is just one way these companies have changed. We asked Dr. Relina Joseph, Associate Dean for Diversity and Student Affairs at the University of Washington Graduate School, how executives can make real change.
With executives, one of the things we sometimes have them do is look at their mentorship circles. So a way in which we are able to pass down power is who we are choosing to mentor. So do we choose to, oftentimes we're mentoring people that remind us of a little us, right? I'm gonna choose that person to bring in because they're gonna remind me of myself. And that reproduces power in all different types of ways. And so I have people look at their mentorship circles, right? And if someone chooses to bring into their mentorship circle someone who is different from them in terms of race and gender, and the powerful moments that can actually come from highlighting that person and bringing them into all of the sacred areas. So not just hiring someone, right, which is important, but making sure that after you hire them, that you are shepherding them through to make sure that they're actually going to be successful. What does that feel like? So seeing power and seeing how power operates is a really powerful thing for people who have never experienced that in their lives.
So what would it mean if America's boardrooms and executive suites looked more like, well, America? Kristen Ayers talked to Nate Miles, the Vice President of Strategy Initiatives for Eli Lilly, about where corporations are going wrong when it comes to diversity and how they can fix it.
You know, within weeks of George Floyd's killing, we saw a lot of corporations coming out, making statements in support of Black Lives Matter, making statements against racism. Tell me what was significant about these statements.
Well, I think what was significant mostly is the fact that companies realized it was important to get on record that it was important to them, to their employees, to their companies, that they had something to say, and that they felt somehow that the African American community meant something to them, and they wanted to extend their condolences in some kind of way and reach out to the African American community and say, we feel your pain. And that was something they wanted to do, and do it quickly in that moment.
Beyond those statements, companies have pledged to do everything from donate money to organizations that fight racism to hiring more diverse workforces. Have those actions been enough so far?
I think some have made some actions. I think some have started taking actions. I don't think that they have lived up to all of the pledges that they have made. I think many made some pledges in the heat of the moment. It is going to be the sustainability that is going to be the question. A year from now, it will be interesting to go back in and see, quite frankly, Kristen, how many of them do have more African Americans on their boards? How many of them do have more African Americans in their workforce? How many of them have partnered with African American organizations? Those are the things that can really make a difference in the life of a community. And if they did those things a year from now, then you can say that this George Floyd moment was worth all it was cracked up to be. Otherwise, again, it was just empty rhetoric that was espoused at a time when the company needed something to say, and it would have been a real missed opportunity.
What are your thoughts on companies that offer financial incentives, bonuses, for example, to managers who are able to bring more diversity to their teams? Is that a way to close this gap?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that everyone should have that as one of their elements of their job description.
And what do you say to those who say it's controversial to offer incentives to hire more people of color?
It's no more controversial than saying you want a top-notch salesperson as opposed to an introverted salesperson. It's no more controversial to hire a person of color than it is to hire a disabled veteran. It's no more controversial than it is to hire get more females into the workforce. It's no more controversial than going out and hiring these people from Harvard, Yale, and some of these other places that have degrees from the colleges that we all know, wink, wink, that we prefer to hire from.
What reflects whether they're actually making these institutional changes?
I think it's the authenticity. I think, are you going into communities? Are you hiring interns into your internship program? Are you bringing in entry-level people who are going to be on the fast track to work themselves up? Are you bringing in C-suite people who are going to be able to impact that's where policy is made at? Are you putting people on your boards of directors who are going to set the policy for your company at those levels, and how your company is going to operate? For instance, if you're Amazon, are you going to locate a fulfillment center in a African American community that has 18% unemployment, which is extremely high at this point? much higher than in Washington state. So many times people will act like it's like rocket science. Oh my God, how do we do this? How do we do this? It's not rocket science. It's basic community development. It's basic community building. Companies should start from the position that you are not in the right place, regardless of what you've done in the past, regardless of the George Floyd moment, regardless of all of that other stuff. You are not in the right place. Just acknowledge and believe right now that you're not in the right place, that you have some work to do, especially in that community. Because of all of the stuff that has taken place in the past, you have some work to do.
A white dad comes to the realization he's racist. Coming up, he invites us to come along as he works with a race educator to better understand his biracial daughter. Our final episode of Facing Race is next week, but this is just the beginning. We're excited to announce, starting in early 2021, we'll be launching Facing Race as a permanent part of our newscasts, making King 5 one of only a few local news organizations in the country to have a race and social justice unit. We're committing to covering race and equity in the Pacific Northwest in a way that we never have before, bringing you stories and solutions you won't find anywhere else. Kristen Ayers has a look ahead at one of the many stories to come.
I was kind of raised, to be us against them. I know that if I see a group of white kids and I see a group of black kids, I'm going to be more on guard with the black kids because of the way that I was trained, the way I was raised. I'm just trying to, I guess, be really honest.
His name is Steve Ramey, a Washington father with a secret that few people would have the courage to say out loud.
I know it's a really harsh thing to say, and I don't want to say it, and I know that people are going to take it wrong, but I know that I'm racist, and I don't want to be. I don't mean to be. I'm trying not to be. I'm trying to, and that's kind of what we're doing here, is how do I not be, when it's been ingrained in me for my whole life. I'm 60 years old. So my daughter is mixed. And we never really had a conversation about how that affects her.
He's raised his daughter, Caitlin, since she was 5 years old.
I went to a mostly white school. I would get called names a lot. They'd call me like brownie or like racist names, or they call me like monkey, like a monkey. I didn't really know that I was racist. I'm confused with my identities.
An interracial family rocked by a racial justice uprising, searching for answers.
What I can do personally is give my daughter a voice. And at the same time, I'm going to hopefully learn what can I do to be more conscious about being racist.
Starting in February, Facing Race goes deeper with race educator and coach Karina Hooks.
We're just going to have real, honest conversations. What do you think's wrong with you?
Not good enough.
According to who?
To the white man.
To help a Washington family face race head on.
I do say racist stuff, and I don't mean, a lot of it's out of humor.
How does it make you feel?
Uncomfortable and angry.
But what if your jokes and your words harm?
Now I can't even laugh. I know I'm going to be challenged. I know I'm probably going to get angry.
I think there will be, at points in our journey, just some harsh but transformational moments.
I think it's going to be beneficial, though.
Steve's first step to becoming an anti-racist was to first identify he had racist thoughts. To watch our first story about Steve and his daughter, text the word DAD to 206-448-4545. Well, now it's time for our experts to answer your questions that you may have been too embarrassed or too afraid to ask. Tonight's frequently awkward question from a Port Orchard viewer: I find the N-word to be quite offensive. I don't use it, but why does that word seem to be perfectly okay for African Americans to use within their own group? The answer from King 5 race consultant and co-founder of Cultures Connecting, Caprice Hollins.
There's a lot of division, even in the Black community, about whether or not that word is appropriate. As a woman who's always been small, I would never make any comments about someone who's overweight. Right? I don't understand the pain that comes with that. I don't understand any suffering, the discrimination. that comes with it. If a person is overweight and makes a joke about themselves or makes a joke about weight, that's for them to do, and that's for them to question whether or not that's an okay thing to do. But someone on the outside of that experience, I would never say anything about someone's weight, because I have no idea what that's like to live my life as a person in a country that discriminates against full-bodied people.
If you have a question for our experts, text FAQ to 206-448-4545. Next week on Facing Race, his killing sparked a movement.
My name is Shayla Zartman. I'm 22 years old from Gig Harbor, Washington, and I'm George Floyd's cousin.
George Floyd's Washington family speaks out in a Facing Race exclusive.
It happened in 8 minutes and 46 seconds, but this I will be going through for the rest of my life.
Their battle for justice.
Say his name!
And how what happened to him has changed them forever.
A fire has been set off inside my soul. I'm here for a reason. I have a purpose. I have work to do.
If you want to watch any of the stories we've done for this original series or check out our resource guide, go to king5.com/facingrace. And we thank you for joining us tonight and invite you to watch our final episode coming up next week. Good night.